Hi, Alberto. Hi, Cynthia. How are you doing? Hi, Ray.
Hello, I'm doing okay.
Good. So, Ray, I put the feedback for your resume in the CIS 200 course, so make sure you check that out.
Oh, I did. I will alter it. I always get a little confused on how much to add. See, I never want to be inaccurate. I always want to put because I can boast all these things, and then when it comes down to it, I know a set number of things, and I'd rather be truly honest. So what I'll do is I will put that stuff in there, but I'll just make sure it's exactly what I know. I don't want to be one of those
Right,
people who are, you
right.
know,
And you
I
want to
always
put the
struggle with that.
skills but you want to align the skills to the job posting
Mm-hmm.
or the job responsibility. And yeah, you should put the skills that you're comfortable doing. That's
Mm-hmm.
important for everyone to put on your resume. I used to interview a lot of people, and 80% of the people usually lie about their skills.
Yeah, see, I don't want to do that. I really don't.
Yeah.
And
So,
that's what I always struggle with. That's why I feel like entry level stuff. I want them to know I'm still learning. I know that. I'm not gonna say I'm a master at this or
but it's okay to list that you have knowledge of those things that you know. And then I want to iterate this to everyone, okay? It's important that you write down the things that you know throughout time because you will forget to put that on resume, even including myself. Like I go back every time I look at my resume, I'm like, oh, I forgot to put this. I did this. So it's important to keep notes of the things that you're doing, could be throughout the months or the year, because looking back, you might forget to put something. And then if you generalize the statement, sometimes employers they are looking for a little bit more.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
true.
So
I got
for
a I
Chris,
got a
yeah,
question for that.
sure, sure.
So so if you put that on your resume, right? But did you know the knowledge? Because this happened to me. Remember, I told you a week ago or 2 weeks
So,
ago that I had the job interview with Infosys.
mhm.
So I got asked stuff from my from what I know, but it's just knowledge that I have, but I don't continuously practice. And they asked me about that, and I froze.
So
So
what
how?
you need to be clear on your resume, especially if you use verbiage like expertise, they're gonna expect expertise. Okay?
Okay.
So you have to be clear on what you know. If you know it really well, then you can use that term. If you don't know it well, you need to be careful on how you state that. So you can have a list of a category for knowledge, right? And then a category for expertise or skills that you are very comfortable doing. And in a lot of like the things that I list that I know really well, I would put that under expertise, right? And that
Okay.
comes from experience or things that I've been doing. And my list of things throughout time is a lot of vendor specific things. For example, I would list VMware vSphere, different version that I've used. Software tools, hardware tools that you know that employers would automatically pick out when they look at your resume. And you don't have to don't be lengthy because it, they're gonna have 2 minutes to scheme through your resume. Okay, most managers do. I've
Okay.
done it. Many people in my field done it. They look for specific keywords, so use the proper keywords. And the best way to do it to go back to the inventory, like for example, this class, we're gonna use specific vendor and we're gonna use specific library. So when you're writing down programming in Python for network devices, colon and then put down the vendor specific and the library specific so that way people understand what you're capable of. But again, if you have practical experience, list them as practical experience. If you have
Okay.
knowledge of, list them as knowledge, right? But
Yeah.
when you list the courses, it does no good to employer. I've talked to many employers and they tell me, students list courses. We don't have time to look up the description for the courses, so if you list the course, list what you're capable of doing out with the knowledge that you gain from that course, and make a list. Just remember, list on your resume. That's safe, right?
Okay.
Um, and resume is something that you would need to finesse throughout time. And I recommend checking it every month or two, and then editing it as you go, because you will forget. I've worked with many students and many employers, and even people who worked under me. Sometimes I ask them a question, they're like, "Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that I have done this and this and this." So it's important to point that out. Okay,
Okay.
so going back, um, sorry, my schedule has been super tight, and I made it a point to grade your stuff. Okay, and the students. I think I'm pretty caught up with all my classes, but I'm teaching 5, so I apologize if things don't come in Canvas a little sooner than expected. I want to make sure that things are clear and things are detail oriented, so you can use your notes and your assignments for future references. Okay. um I'm gonna go into screen share. Let me get to this, and then I will add the video on today. And I also shared the opportunity for extra credit because my system kind of froze a little bit. So hopefully I don't get booted out. Okay, now it's going. Okay, sorry. It gets a little crazy in my neighborhood around this time because people are on Zoom for school and stuff. Um, this is the one of the things that we're doing. So if you're interested, check that out. I think they extended the registration until today or a few days later. I know that the registration with IREX require like some form of ID. People are a little bit skeptical about that, but I think they wanted to validate the user. I have to upload my ID as a facilitator. So I facilitate this event. So if you attend, you can get some extra credit. If not, there will be other opportunity to gain extra credit. So let's talk about the notes. You can download the notes. I hope it came through on Canvas. Yes, it did. Because Canvas is a little spotty lately. Let me zoom in on this. I alt texted some of the stuff. It's a lot of work putting together the notes because we have to make sure accessibility is enabled on it. That means that any picture we use, we have to describe. Okay, so this week is pretty cool from 2 perspectives, like we talked about last week. You saw how you were able to automate the login process with SSH through our lab. And then you were able to use pexpect library along with the Paramiko. And I didn't touch on NetMiko in the lab, but NetMiko is often used for device configuration. So this week we're going to dive a little bit deeper from 2 perspectives. Number one, if you become a technician and security, networking, and support either area, you can utilize this knowledge to automate a lot of the things that you can do with the network configuration. The second perspective is for those of you who want to get into development side. You know that on the low level for development in appliances, this is a big area for Python development, and also, in JSON, how to use JSON with Python. So you can see how the devices are communicating, and even program the instructions for these devices to understand different commands. So we have to understand the process on how devices connect, how you can set up configuration on these devices, because developers work on this, right? So you will be seeing APIs with different vendors. So we're going to touch on Cisco, Juniper, and Arista. Those are some of the main vendors that you see in most network environment. Many people, including students that have taken Cisco classes, they assume that Cisco is used in most in networking devices. That's it. But on the scale of data center, you have to know that there are other vendors that are just as large. And some are older, some are about the same time as Cisco or even a little later. So we're going to touch on that today. Okay. So going back to what we talked about last week, we touch on how API is basically a way that we can communicate with the appliance. It's a way that human can interface with the actual hardware device, like a switch, a router, a security appliance, intrusion detection system, and some have a software interface, a user interface that's more friendly than others. But all of these devices coming back to what we would see with CLI, which is command line interface, and then now the later ones, you would see that they would have their own API, and they streamline the process for developer or administrator a little bit. So we'll talk about that. So API is defined as a set of subroutine, which consists of functions or methods and protocols. And the protocols is incorporated so that way we standardize how the devices communicate across. So for example, for a switch that's going to support SSH or FTP, or even other form of protocols like IP, TCP, all of that, we have to incorporate a way that we can have a uniform structure on how we develop or design these appliances so that way they can communicate across. Otherwise, you would run into something that we know as legacy, in that you have to buy specific vendor all the way across the network, and that device only work with the same type of device, and we don't want that, to be able to support multiple network interface across the world, right? So this is why these tools are essential for the people to be able to configure these devices and allow these devices to communicate. Okay, so here at the beginning, it discussed the application programming interface, which is API. And a good API allows the computer or the system to be able to easily be managed, and we can interact with the system so that way we can control the system for different purposes. So when we look at from what you see as a cloud environment, all of these devices are interworking so that way we would have web services, we would have application that runs on top of web services. Servers are communicating in a model format, for the client server environment. But overall, when we look at that, clouds itself or data center or even a large LAN is an infrastructure. Infrastructure would entail things that you need to support for applications, for your user connectivity, for data transfer, for email, all of these elements. It's going to come back to the network itself. And this is why I stress to student that you can create applications and do that all day, but you have to really understand some of the connectivity and how these systems communicate, and in order to set up sockets and to be able to connect with your servers, etc. So the book discussed the intent-based networking and intent-driven networking. And basically, this is an idea of defining the state of your network so that way your software tools can work with that specific state. So for example, if I turn on my switch or my router, it gets into a different state because not all appliances are enabled to start with. So with that, I have to interface with these appliances to tell it to enable. And you saw last week that when we work with systems, like if you wanted to connect to your Raspberry Pi or an FTP site, you have to establish, right? You have to tell it to really connect to that system, either via IP address or a domain name. So at that point, what you have is you have a state, and you would use the script or the software tool to be able to either configure that state or utilize that state for other purposes. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to our assignments. Going back to beginning, let me zoom in on this. So it asks you to define intent-driven networking. And this is when we would use code or script. Sorry, let me retype this. To enforce networking state or the network state. Okay. So later on, we're going to see some example. And if you read through chapter 3 in the text, it shows how we would look at different stages for that appliance and be able to translate that to processes that needs to be incorporated in our script. So for example, we would enable the device so that way it would turn on and that port will be available. Then we need to connect to it, right? Or establish the connection to another device. And then we sometime would require SSH key setup to be able to actually terminal into that device, and then we can start configuring. And after you configure, you would save, and that establish the networking or the communication of that device. So it's a way that we would use our software tool to enforce the network state. And that allows us to save time and effort over time, because when you look at the data center, or you might have multiple racks of switches, routers, security appliance of the same brand, because that's the way we do things, is we buy it so that way we would be able to work with the same type of device or the same vendor, right? For support reasons, for firmware update reasons, etc. So this allows us to create script and code that will work with the appliances. And the initial part would take a little bit of effort, but after you have that, right? Imagine if you have thousands and thousands of systems like Facebook, or hundreds and thousands, right? This would help you with managing, especially with an inventory, connectivity, making sure it's available, changing configuration, supply change management, etc. Okay. Any question with the first question in our assignment? And then we'll touch on the Python side of the house. We wanted to make sure that you understand the purpose behind this, right? And as we go through, we would see that we would elevate from the low level to a higher level on how you would interface with these devices. Okay. So there's no exact solution, right? And as you get into organizations, people are using different vendor, but the system process is the same: enable, login, or authenticate, right? Show configuration, access, and then reconfigure, save. Okay, and it's across, Cisco or different brands. So in the text, it starts talking about screen scraping, and screen scraping is more of a legacy approach in how we would look at the similarity across these device interface, and what do we look for, certain things like what we talked about with using p-expect. What do you expect from these appliances interface, right? So we would have some kind of addresses, some sort of protocol, some sort of port configuration across. But the challenge that you come across when working with these devices, even though it's in the same series of the device, for example, Cisco, as I mentioned before in the first week, Cisco would have a set of appliance in that series. Let's say that you're buying a Cisco, the Cisco ASA, right, which is used for security appliances from a small scale to a large scale. You will find that some of these models are inconsistent in commands, in how the interface is going to be. The later ones would have a software tool where you can use a mouse. The earlier, but it also have CLI, and some of the commands won't work with the older one compared to the newer one. So there's some inconsistency as vendor gradually change the way that they would implement instructions for these appliances. So here it talks about how originally when we do screen scraping, we would look for white spaces, line breaks, things like that to kind of set up some kind of, command for the system to, store something or change configuration. But last week we talked about Paramigo and using that library to for configuration purposes and or for even connecting to that system. So here it touches on Cisco NX, and Cisco NX is basically it has its own version of the iOS where we would be able to interface with it and set it up so that way it would be able to interface with other device. Okay. And using library tools, we would need to incorporate how we would be able to interface with the system and write the script in order to do that. So here it talks about the process on how you would go about, setting up the configuration, looking at each of the line and how that would be if you needed to modify the IP address or change the interface for connection purposes. Okay. Now, the challenge that we come across with this is going to be that when you scale it for hundreds and thousands of appliances, that becomes an issue, right? That is a lot of manpower and effort. So this is why Python comes into play, where we would shave off some of the time where we initially would set up the script, and it would help us with streamlining the process in administration and also in, reconfiguring a lot of these systems. Um, and the predictability based on vendor, the differences in the versions for the vendor, that might be an issue as well. Okay. And Cisco and other vendors are known to do this. They would lock in on a certain version and then they would retire that software version because they want the consumer or companies to buy the newer device with the newer version of the OS. And this is how it's a business driven solution, right? So here, what it's showing you here is that what we can do is we can think about how we would use the dictionary in Python and be able to use key and its values to really set up a lot of the things for this type of appliance, right? So like setting up IP addresses or say what that would be when, for the configuration, what type of IP addresses that you use. So when you look at this is the dictionary. And on the left, you would see the keys, right? And then on the right, those are the values, and the values would be stored into the RAM of the appliance. Okay. So we would have the interface name, right? And that's really tied to the physical port, the connection port of that appliance. And some of these devices have lots of ports, like the switch, or in the case of a router, you would have only a few, for out and then for maybe a couple of in. So here gives you an example of how to implement the dictionary, right? And when we would be able to really output this or utilize it, it encompasses XML or JSON. So the later devices, what you see is you would see that it's utilizing JSON. So and if you research JSON, right, that is really JavaScript object notation. And this is a way that we can make it easy for us to read and write. You can extract the data and put it into text format. And many cases, I normally use XML with Excel or a spreadsheet in order to, have a list of something. And in network administration, we are looking at, right? Like if in a data center scale, you wanted to look at which systems is up and which system is down and the status of that. Yes, you do have monitoring tools that you would buy from a third party in order to do that. But when we're looking at the low level, we can actually, build the script in order to build this list. Okay. Because part of the job with the technician or the administration level is to make sure, right, that you have maintained these appliances and you got to use a list in order to do that. Okay. So here it touches a little bit on what JSON is, and it works with C, C++, C Sharp, Java, JavaScript, Perl, Python, and other languages. So you often see this being used quite a bit. Okay. And so as you can see, it has the object and incorporated with white space and string and white space and the value. So this is why, in the CLI, earlier we talked about, screen scraping, we're looking for the white space and specific string. So to incorporate the object, we would be able to implement what we would see with dictionary and utilize some kind of expectation in regular expression in our script. So to answer the next question, for number 2, using Paramiko library, how do you write script for API structured output? You would first create a dictionary, and that dictionary encompasses, state for your system, configuration details that would align with the appliance API, right? Because simply we don't want to type in individual field, right, of the device information. What we're doing is we're creating a nested list or a dictionary to be able to plug in the values into, when it sees the keys. And we would use the regular expression to identify things like line break or white space. And when we use the Paramiko library with the dictionary, we can utilize it to configure appliances. Okay. Any question with this? So as we mentioned about some challenges with screen scraping, sometimes you might be parsing different information for output because, like I mentioned, even with the same vendor and the same series of appliance, you might have different different commands being used, different fields for specific things for information. So that might be challenging. Vendor use different software versions, which can create error or scalability problem. Okay. So going back to what we say, okay, so if I write an automated tool in Python, I have to look at how that tool will work across all the appliances. right? The best way to really, before you begin, is to look at, the processes in the interface of that appliance, and the documentation would help you with that too. Okay, so Cisco does a good job with providing you the details on how to interact with that device using their commands. And when you test, you first have to test it, right? Like how we would test with the SSH process last week. We have to see what is it really doing at different stages. So that way, when we write the program, we would plug in different, you know, data or information into specific process. And that can become an issue if it's different throughout. Any question? Okay, so no questions. So I'll move on with this. And again, you can find all of this information from your notes. So here, it mentioned about the Python library where you don't have to parse like what we would see with screen scraping. You would then take the key values or retrieve values that are associated with the key. Then you can transfer that into some form of list or container that you can later use. And larger companies, they would have a database in order to manage all of their appliances, right? I'm talking about, data center scale like Amazon or Google, or some of the social network media websites like provider like Facebook, Twitter. And they actually outsource that to a company that does data center for them. So we have to also look at how that would work with the API languages, right? And in this particular chapter, we're going to focus on Netconf for net configuration, Netconf, okay? And so you do see some various versions or different type, like REST API or RESTconf. And this is, Netconf and RESTconf is specifically used for appliances API. So with this type of skill sets, if you're looking at, programming type of positions, you can think about how you wanted to get into, work with engineers and developer for the hardware appliances. And Cisco makes tons of money doing this, from home appliances to business appliances. Okay, next we're going to talk about data modeling. And data model is a way that we would organize the elements of data, and so that way they would be standardized, that would relate to real world entities. Okay, so it would specify the data element that would represent some form of property for that object or for that thing in the real world. And our thing is going to be the switch, the router, communication devices, Wi-Fi appliances, security appliances. So the example that's shown here, in that you would have a data model for a car. It would consist of different elements. So we would have activity model, and then the data that would be related to that activity. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to create some type of data model that would translate to the functionality of that device or that vehicle in this example, right? In that sense. So for the network data model, it would be something that we would look at for our data center, or in the case in a very large scale, worldwide, global wide area network. And we would start with the physical layer going into the layer 2. And so that would be where your switch would be. So how the switch would store our physical system addresses and map it to each port, so that way we would have different segment of the network. So looking at this, for a switch data model, that would be consists of MAC addresses that's kept in a table. So it needs to organize the addresses to the table, so that would have specific keys. And the key would then represent, could be the system or different network properties. So when I'm looking at a MAC table, I would see that, each of the system could be system name, right? Host name. And then it would have the physical address that's for the network interface card or the wireless interface card for that particular appliance or device. So it it would use that to really map where that device actually physically sit in the network. So first, then we would have to look at how many devices is the switch handling. Let's say that I have a 48 port switch, that will be 48 devices that will be connecting to the switch. So the table would consist of 48 host 48 host names, and its correlated values would be the MAC addresses in hexadecimal. Okay. And so when the administrator, when they would get the ARC table, they would be able to see, right, the key and its value based on that. So when we put all of this together, we have to look at, right, what is it that we are storing? How would that be associated with the container that we're building? And at what part of the process is this data being accessed when we model that out? So to go to the next question, it asks about what is a data model and what is a network data model. So the data model is an abstract model that organizes elements of the data and standardizes how they relate to one another and to the properties of the real world entities. The network data model is also an abstract model that describes the network. That could be a data center, a campus, it could be a facility where they would have system that's connected, or it could be in a large scale. So when you're looking at company that does global networking, right, where they would have services in different countries, especially telecommunication company, that would be, they need to model that out. And for each of the appliance, how that would be connecting and what kind of data that's going to be utilized.
So the data models used for the API?
Yes. So in the design process of the API, right, they build a model for specific appliances or series of appliances. And when we look at the processes in that, and what, like for example, last week when you use SSH, right, for your Pi or for your system, your Linux system, we first have to check out the sequence in the process and what kind of information needs to be entered, like passwords, right? And then, before we could enter the password, we have to obtain the RSA key ID and be able to utilize that. So in that, we would have, specific process, and doing each process, how certain piece of data is being used. And that's important to think about when you put together, your software, your script tool to interface with these API, because API itself contains data model. Okay. Other questions? All right. So let's touch on the next part. So here it moves on, and it gives you some example about the routers and how the number of routes they would contain. We call it routing table. And the router actually maintains a list of adjacent routers. So when you're looking at AS in the first week, I talk about, those are the type of systems that would automatically transfer your packet right to the destination. Usually it does the quickest way, right? The fastest route first. Or sometimes it will be first come, first serve basis. So what it does is it's always advertising itself. It's going to say, hey, I'm here, who's ready, right? And so you would think about in a internet environment, you would have all of these routers that is basically telling each other that, hey, I'm not ready, I'm ready, give it to me, I'm first, things like that. And so when it does that, it actually maintains a list of neighbors that are available, so that way it can quickly revert to that cache information to really route the packet quickly to the destination and come back. And sometimes you have the same route coming back, and sometimes you don't, because other routers now then become available. Okay, so in this sense, when we're looking at a factory network, we really have to look at, right, how many of these routers are interworking together, and what would be the next hop would be. So when you do like a trace route command in Windows environment, right, when you see is it's listing the hops of adjacent routers where it's passing that through. Okay. And sometimes when the routers are busy, they don't respond. It just pass it to the next one that's available. And this is the way that we build our protocol to work that's standardized with all of these systems. Okay. So going into the next one, it talks about Yang is the yet another next generation. And this is a data modeling language. It is used to look at how we would be able to incorporate the language for device configuration across different vendor using Netconf protocol. So, and almost all major vendors use Netconf protocol. They agree, right? In order to sell to the consumer, we want to make sure that it's, so if I purchase Juniper device, it will work with Cisco. The only difference is the API and the commands are going to be different. Okay. Because that allows us to be able to have options in setting up our network with different type of vendor specific appliances. So this is aimed to work with the abstraction layer with the protocols like Netconf for vendor-specific syntax pertaining to commands with the configuration and use. Okay. So I put down that Yang is a data modeling language. It is used to model configuration of devices. It can also represent the state data manipulated by the Netconf protocol, Netconf remote procedure calls, and Netconf notifications. It aims to provide a common abstract layer between the protocols used and the underlying vendor-specific syntax for configuration and operation. So the industry created this so that way doesn't matter what type of commands that the vendor incorporate and the subroutines, it will work across, right? And using, a standardized set of rules, which is Netconf protocol. And with that, we can use it to configure our system. So when they build the API, considering that it would work with this protocol, we have to incorporate the data modeling language like this one. Okay. And
Why would-
Netconf, yes, go ahead, Michelle.
Why would they have to make a separate data modeling language and not just use like C++ or something?
Because it would be on the lower level, because C++ or C# or C, it is a higher level language. Even Python, right? When you write subroutines, a lot of the time it needs to be on low level for these appliances to work. So assembly, even take that, so that way the system would eventually store everything in digital format. Okay, so and not all vendor would use the same type of language, and that can create a problem as well. Okay, so now streamlining from that based on your questions, yes, eventually we want to think about how we would be able to incorporate higher language and into some type of assembly. And you would see some of this already for certain architecture. And also assembly is pertaining to the processor, and all of these have different processors. So take note of that. It's kind of like you have variations of different products, and you have to make sure that these different products work together somehow. So we would have a mid-level, right, type of language that would incorporate the protocols so that way they can understand each other.
Okay.
Questions? Okay. So with this, we are going to look at Cisco Nx. And Cisco Nx use the NC client library. And this library allows us to work with Nx API using Netconf. And it takes you to the sandbox environment where you can take a look at the type of commands and the equivalent in script in Python. So they thought about this and they said we need to incorporate a sandbox environment where developers and administrator can go in there and work with the API for that appliance to be able to write various programs for automation purposes or for operation purposes. Okay. So in the later section of your notes, it talks about Nx API. And the way that you install this, there's some dependency, and this one works with Python 3. Okay. In Python 2, you can tell it's a little different. However, there are some additional library that you need to obtain with it. Okay. And all of these library that we're going to look at today, all of them pertain to request and response, right? The system is going to request some kind of information. The user is going to type that in. So when we automate that process, we basically incorporate the script for the request and the response process for our system interface. So when you install Nx API, this is the command for that. And this is for Ubuntu. So it's slightly different than with different Linux releases. Okay, keep in mind. And with the NC client, as I mentioned, we can install the NC client. They have a GitHub repo. So basically we need to pull it from the GitHub repo. So we would clone it and then change to the directory. And then we would do the setup.py install. So touching back on this, in case you didn't get it, we would use NC client library with Netconf for Nx API configuration, and that would be taking us to the sandbox purposes, and we'll talk about the sandbox.
Question.
Yes.
So, Chow, the author of the book,
Mhm.
talks about he doesn't know how he would have done something, and he would have almost called the office and cried for help. How would you, like, if you're on the networking job, you don't know how to do something, what would you do?
For me, I
Like,
would research.
just on the
And then
internet?
if I can't find something after, at least 8 hours of looking into something, and that's assuming that if we have time, right? But if you don't have time, then you would have to ask somebody for help. And yeah, what he's saying is that he did ask people for help, and then at least they can point him to a certain direction. But in some cases, you will have to go back to the vendor and ask them, and then they might be able to bring forth some engineer and developer and be able to work with you on that. And this is why sometimes we can chat with support, and this is why people pay Cisco a lot of money to be able to provide their support even after when their warranty has been expired. So they would pay for that extension of it, so that way, in case if in a dev of environment or in a data center, this is what you would see, right? Where time is a resource, and if we don't have that, we have to go back to the vendor and ask them for assistance. But yeah, I would contact the vendor and ask, because if I can't get certain things to work, then and they care about your long-term partnership, so they will work with you. Okay. But yeah, I would not cry. I think he's just exaggerating based on that. He just talk about how it could be difficult. Okay, so with this, what we see is we would see, okay, some of the procedure that would netconf, right? In order to access the system, we have to enable the system, like I said, and then we have to log in. because all of these systems keep a log of things. And you know, when you take security classes, so when you heard about this, we revert back to the logs to really track events, incidents, you know, things that are happening in our network. Monitoring purposes, we use logs. Okay, so here it shows how you would create a user, right? And then passphrase. They don't call it password, Cisco call it passphrase. And so now in this particular API, you're able to use port 80, which is HTTP for configuration. But the sandbox is okay, make sure that I clarified this. Sandbox is used for testing purposes, not live. Okay, so this is being done before we incorporate that appliance and roll our network live, right? Let's say that you are thinking of implementing this appliance in your network. You want to be able to test it first and see if you can automate some of the process before you plug it into your network and use it. So this is why with the sandbox configuration, we can test the appliance, right? Write the tools that we need, and then, you know, test our tools in a virtual environment. And then we would, once we roll it live, you don't use the sandbox for that system. You use it just for preparation and testing. So here it shows you how we can use the HTTP and the sandbox configuration. So I am then would use the port 80, and NX, notice that it uses the OS version. So it does have a little bit of click and point. If I think I taught a security class where we use the ASA 5500, and the students were able to see something similar to this. So there is some, you know, capability in where you can, you know, you can type in something, you can choose something, you can click something. So with the NX API sandbox, what you can do is you can put in the command, right? And then it's going to give you the JSON format. But in this one, it also gives some options, and some of the other ones actually give you Python options. So we'll talk about Juniper after Cisco. So you would then take the JSON format, which is an XML, and you can use that with your script. Okay. So with the JSON RPC and the CLI command type, show version command. So when we type in Cisco show version, what that does is it tells you the OS version, and if we're using CLI, it will tell you the CLI version. And if it's outdated, then you want to be able to update it. You know, and often we would want to show what type of version it's using. So in this example that he's showing is when you type in show version, all that does is it's going to give us information about that build for that software tool. And in the response, as you can see in the screen capture, it shows you here the build of that particular OS version 2. So now with that, and if you wanted to see JSON documentation, you can go there, which is the site I showed you earlier. So with that, what we can do is we can take the message format, which is the response data field keys, and we would be able to think about how we would put it all together as a container in our program or our script. Okay. So this is an example of how you would write it using the NC client. And in this case, we're only importing the manager method, right? And so here it established the connection, This is the host IP, the port, and you know that port number by now, SSH. And it's going to plug in the username and the password. Some system won't have the username like you saw with Linux, Ubuntu last week, but in Cisco case, it's going to ask for the username, it's going to ask for passphrase, and then it's going to verify the keys. And since this is an NX, which stands for Nessus, it's going to look for specific keys. So here, basically, we're putting in the values, right, for host key validation. And then we would, because it's a container, right? This is what you guys remember? Is it a tuple? Okay. Then we would use a for loop to be able to print out the values and then end the connection. So simply when we look at this process, what do? We log in, right? We connect to that system. We log in, we authenticate, we access system configuration information, and then we log out. But in this case, we wanted to print out the value, which is the configuration information that's going to be for our session. Okay. So here it talks about how you would use port username, password, and then the parameter for the device that you would be connecting to. And when we're using the Juniper, it's a little different, as it is a different manufacturer. It uses the known host requirement for SSH. Okay. So the output from that program, it's going to show this because we told it to print, right? For that protocol, Netconf. So now with that, it's saying that this is like terminal into the system in all one shot. We terminal in and be able to display the parameters for which is the configuration for that appliance. Okay, by running that one script. Okay. Now, it also worked with HTTPS, right, which is more secure, and that would be port 443 or port 444. But in the HTTP process, what we have is we basically request and then you're going to get response, right? It's a two-way communication. So in this, what it's showing is it's showing how you would use external Python library, and you can find the request library here and be able to implement similar process so that way you can obtain some information of your system as XML. Okay. And this would be another library that you would use. So you would have import request, import JSON, because you wanted to use JSON here, right? And then you would put in the URL, authentication information, and this is going to be the header type, which is going to be for connection purposes with that application, and then the parameter, what we wanted to show as a nested dictionary in a list. So at the end, we wanted to get it to dump the payload and the header at the response, which is going to be pulled from the XML format and shown. So how they ran on the next one, when they verify the software version, they just say they created this file and then they ran it and it would just give you the version of the API. So on the next part, let's answer the sandbox question. When do you need to use API sandbox? When you're checking supportability of the message format, or you need to obtain response data field keys in which you want to retrieve using your script. So we'll do a couple exercises similar to this example that's shown for this week. I'll leave this on here. I think some of you are still probably trying to get that written down. You can find that also in your notes. Any question? We're about halfway through, so we're doing it. We have about an hour left. I have a grant meeting at 4 for like about 30 minutes, and then I'll have my office hours after that. Hopefully I can get off the meeting quick. All right, so here what we see is it talks about how we would use the overall syntax, and considering that we have to incorporate what the host name of that particular appliance, the host name is host name, okay? And in the fourth program that is shown, it actually access the system configuration. So what we did was first, right, we access the system, we authenticate, then we show the version, right, that system is holding, that appliance is using. Then on the fourth script, we would have the configuration set up using the dictionary. Okay. Now you can have it all on one script, but the way I think the author chose to do this is that way you can think of it like individual modules where you can incorporate different programs for different functionality. So instead of modifying the entire very long, lengthy program, what he can do is he can make changes to the smaller program, and it creates a modular environment. So you don't have to go through a longer set of code to fix. And so here it shows the configuration for that particular appliance, and the interface is tied to the physical port of that, and then it's going to do a shutdown. It's shut down. And Netconf is a standalone protocol, right? It needs to work with modeling language, the data model language like Yang, in order to be supported. So here we saw a similar output of this earlier, right? Compare the output that we saw from the actual OS itself to what we would see using the Python for network automation, pretty close, right? You would get sometimes a little bit more. It depends on what you build into your script itself. But here it shows you, we saw earlier that, it shows the version, but here it shows the state of that system and also the timestamp. And then you can get the project, the Yang project GitHub through this link. Okay. So for the next question, question 8, when using NX API Developer Sandbox, how do you convert JSON RPC requests into Python script? So in the actual sandbox, if you're looking at the screenshot from earlier, there's an option where it says request Python. When you click that, it gives you the Python script, and they are supporting 3.x version. So it is in Python 3. So you can simply take that and then put that into your program or your script. Because what it's saying is this command is equivalent to this in Python script. So it gives you the translated process or output for that. Any question? Okay. So next we're going to talk about Cisco ACI, and then we'll move on to Juniper. So Cisco ACI is a tool that's used to centralize, or it is a centralized controller that manage spine leaf top of rack switches, meaning that all the branch out appliances that are interconnected back to possibly the centralized rack. Okay, so you might have one main rack that's going to control the rest of the other racks that have switches, routers in the data center. Okay, or in a huge server room where you would have multiple racks. Okay, this is used with GUI, CLI, or API. So in some appliances, you might have a graphical user interface, like I said, using mouse and keyboard. And in most appliances, you would see CLI where it would be command line interface, or sometimes in our case that we're talking about this week is API. So this is a way that we can control other Cisco appliances, right, through the ACI. Now, a little different than the API CEM. So ACI is, you can use it for the data center operation where the API CEM, that will be used for enterprise module. Okay. They both have different tool sets. This is in the much larger scale, and it works with different type of software modules. Sorry. So the example that's mentioned here is the wireless network for the enterprise, and this is where you would see this tool being used. That will incorporate policies, which is rules for the network appliances on how they would connect and the servers. So In the next question, it asks you the purpose of Cisco ACI. How is it different than ACIEM? ACI aims to provide centralized approach for all network components, where API, I'm sorry, I have a typo here. The API CEM focuses on enterprise module. They can both control network components, but each has different or some shared tool sets. Questions?
Is there a free version?
None. Cisco is never free. Well, I'll dig around and I'll see. Okay. But yeah, usually it's licensed to the appliance or your membership. I'll try to see if we can even simulate it. I doubt it, but you know, now they have a lot of different tools, so I'll look around. I'll let you know on Wednesday. But even get the images. So if you're using Cisco Viral, you might have access to it. They have, I know they have NX on there. I know they have a bunch of stuff. Now also there's different level of viral, right? You got the basic personal viral, and then if you wanted the enterprise DevOps viral, which has more on a data center scale. So I'm thinking it, you know, at least the ACI is on the viral, and then the other one is for the enterprise level is it's the more expensive package. I think it's like $300 versus $200 per license to even simulate and train, right? So this is what I suggest for you if you wanted to get more in depth with that. Find a company that will pay for some of that to get you certified. They have Cisco developer stuff too for certification if you wanted to pursue it. And it's a good company to work for. Okay, so this is two types of controller that we see. Okay, that kind of give you the introduction in that. Even if you talk to some of the small scale administrator, they might not even know that. So, okay. So here it talks about how we would be able to control our network for security reasons, right? Implementing rules on sharing devices and resources, and even system on client server environment. So there's a REST model that uses HTTP and use get, post, delete. So in the Cisco sample, the way that the author set up the lab, you can also find some network devices.py there. This is a function that's used to acquire the header for the device through the controller. And it uses the ticket. See how the API is incorporated here. Okay, we have authentication process. And then since it's using JSON, right, you have the content type and the value is application JSON here. Similar to the last one we looked at, right? In this one, we specify, we declare, or we define the ticket that it's going to be responding, because remember, we're requesting to that service ticket, and it's going to return the ticket. So when it output, it's going to look like this. Okay. I'm sorry, that will be parsed. With the with the output, it would look like this. And this one, they looked at the wireless controller. So you see that? So the ID here is the MAC. Most system uses MAC address as UID or ID. And so now when you look lower, here are a bunch of switch catalysts, 3500, 4400 series, and 5500. This is the wireless one. This is the router. You got the catalyst switches here. This is very common in different series. They have different type of catalysts. Okay. So it shows you the 3500i is the access point, the 4400 ISR, that's a router, the 5500, that's the wireless LAN controller. Now, if you're using for iOS XE script, that's slightly different than the Nessus OS. It has some additional Python programmability feature, and you can find the information on XE here. So Cisco equipped their appliances with different type of OSs where, you know, it allows you to use different tools in order to develop or administer these systems. Any question? Okay. So for the next one, we're going to talk about Cisco Meraki controller. This is used to centralize Wi-Fi control. So think about like how some wireless router at home, right? You can log in via the web and be able to configure or view its status or monitor. And same thing, you would use this type of controller to centralize the Wi-Fi environment. It's used for management purposes. The main thing that's different from the other controller is that this one uses a public cloud URL. So you can use it to retrieve inventory of your connected appliances. You can obtain some network information with it. You can use to manage or configure devices using Cisco Meraki controller. So this is another form of controller, and it's Wi-Fi oriented. So when we say cloud-based, it's going to connect to a server, right? And you just got to authenticate it via web-based, browser-based. Any question? So you can find Cisco Meraki controller on page 10. And the way that we would see this in Python would be like this, right? Import request, that's the request library. Import pprint. And then we would do the API key. Here's the URL. And then we wanted to obtain the or print the response. So we would say response is gonna issue the request from the URL and then we are going to parse it into JSON. So the output would see it like this. Okay. So it gives you the ID information for the connected systems, and then their specification or properties. Question?
Oh no, I just have a comment, like maybe that's how FireEye found the device that wasn't supposed to be.
I'm
logged
sure.
on. Yeah.
But FireEye has, I attended several of their presentations, live demo stuff in the past. They create their own tool to manage. That's their selling points in you know, they do a lot of hosting stuff now, but when they came to the market, they were like the security consultant tools to manage other appliances. Um, and you know, they developed some software, you know, for tracking cryptography and some of these things. So they have like different pieces in what they're selling. But on in the back end, right, if you're stripping down the user interface and the click and point and all of this is the functionality of their software tools. So yes, I had before, they used to have a lot of like tutorials and stuff. I think that they, you know, they have the basic stuff for security now. But yeah, I met a couple of the engineers on malware a while back in San Diego. But yeah, interesting point about FireEye. And are you talking about the breach that happened recently?
Oh yes.
Okay. Yeah, so here's some information or the output for that. Okay. All right. So let's talk about Juniper next. Right. Cisco usually steal the show because they have, you know, but Juniper also has great tools. So Juniper, in an enterprise network, you often see Juniper appliances, and it works with Netconf, very much like Cisco. It also uses XML for data encoding. It has remote procedure called the RPC, and it incorporated HTTPS. So you're going to see some similar commands being used. So at the layers, what you see is you would see the SSH, TLS, HTTP. So happening here at the transport, right? So your data, how it notifies the data through the header. And so the RPC request and reply is happening here with the message piece of that. Okay. So when you're looking at network monitoring tool, when you're looking at the packet, right, some of the content for that packet would work with the RPC in that, especially when you're looking at like HTTP request and reply. So when we dive into the layers of this, right, how each of the appliance, if you're looking at like Cisco or Juniper, communicates, it's going to rely on this piece to be able to notify each other, right, to get some kind of response. So here it shows you the XML management protocol tool for developer guide. Recommended that you look it over, right? It's published on their technical library. Okay. So the device is not enabled by default. we need to enable the device, and then here it shows you how you can log in and also be able to use services like SSH, Telnet, and we can also do Netconf SSH with the port number. So if I was to use the device, right, and I interface with the device, this is the type of command that I would issue, like set system services SSH, set system services Telnet, or set system login user. So we create the user account and we make it a super user. And you know that all of these run some form of Linux in the back. So this is why you see similar command in CLI as you would see in some Linux systems. Okay, so here it shows you where we would set information into our system or configure that. And when we obtain that as XML, it would look like this. Okay, it gives you the timestamp, the user information, of course not the password, right? The host name and the domain name. Now we once we understand the process and what, you know, each of the step, the procedure in setting that information into the system, we can write the Python file. Okay, we will import manager from NC client, like what we've seen previously with also Cisco clients. Okay, and then we would tell which host it is, what port number it is, username, password, right? Timeout is this is in seconds. And then here is our dictionary. The device parameter, we're gonna give it Juno for the name. Okay. Then host key verify, we're gonna say that's gonna be false. So when we, after this, we wanted to issue the command show version, like what we've done in the Cisco, where it's gonna show the version number, make it a text format. Then we're gonna print and then end our session. Okay, so when it outputs, here it is. It tells you the Juno base, that's its OS. Okay, Juniper OS or Junos, and the release or the build. But in order to obtain that, right, you have to log in, and then it tells you the model. So what is this information useful for? Inventory, of course, right? And whether you can check for updates or not, because for audit purposes and security, we have to do at least once a year inventory. They do it more frequent than that, but you need to check the OS and the appliance. Okay. So this is another Python file. It shows you how you would use NC client, and what we see before, we import manager, but in this one, you saw also do an XML import. And when, instead of all the extra elements that you've seen, right? So once you authenticate, you basically do the same thing here for authentication. And then you will be able to also do configuration by using the sub-el config. Okay. So we can modify the configuration. This screenshot shows you how you would use functional method, right? for various purposes: connection, show commands, and show configuration or push configuration. So it would be better if we just write the method and then call those methods, right? Because each of them has different tasks. Okay, so in a larger program, this is what you would see. We would connect, right? We would be able to show the commands, because that could be depending on the model, right? Some commands would be slightly different, because in general, say Juniper would have these sets of commands, but when you get into specific model, they might have different commands. So that's what you would list the command first. And that's a practice with all network appliances, doesn't matter which vendor. You log in, you show version, and so that way you know which software tool you're working with and what command you need to issue, right? And then here we wanted to configure and lock the configuration. That means we're going to save it and not, so that way it doesn't modify. So you're going to commit and lock it. Okay. All right, let's answer some more questions. Okay, so for 11, what type of output should you expect when you're using Juniper netconfig or netconf? You would expect an XML output. You can parse it into text. How do you configure netconf for XML API using PyEasy? We're going to touch on that next. We basically would set the services for netconf, which is a protocol. On top of that, we would also use SSH. And then we specify the port number. And you do this in command line. And you need to do that first. Otherwise, you won't be able to use your script for SSH to get in. And Juniper devices supports SSH. You don't want a telnet. We don't telnet anymore. We would use SSH as substitute. We talked about that last time. Okay, so you have to set that up first and then run your script, which, automate the SSH process and then automate the configuration process. Okay. So the library that we can use is PyEasy. And PyEasy is on page 15. This is the developer guide for PyEasy. You can press this link or you can click that here. Now, like all libraries, you need to do the installation, but it tells you, gives you the instructions for the operating system for Junos or Juno S, PyEasy. So for Ubuntu, we would do sudo apt-get install, right? Python 3 pip Python. And remember, just like the other one, there's dependency on this. So you have to install all of these additional library in order for PyEasy to work. Okay, so you have to do those packages, and then you would install the Junos Easy and C. So there are two steps in this one, right? We install the dependency and then we install the Junos Easy and C. And for the earlier question, you can find out on page 16 if you need to configure for netconf. We would enable the services by doing set system services netconf SSH port number 830 is the default. And then after that, we would create the user, right? In order to test it, we have to have the user account, of course, assuming that all of this is brand new system, right? So you would have the user and the privilege for that user, which is super user. And then we would have the encrypted password for authentication. This one, because we're using SSH, just like last week, you have to generate the RSA key. So you need to do a key gen. And then after that, you would then publish the key and then access the Python 3 server. So now for Python 2, you would use Python M simple HTTP instead of this. Okay, so it's slightly different if you're looking at like two versions. So what happens here is it says that the public key is put into a temporary directory or temp directory, TMP, where it's going to be enabled for Python 3 HTTP server, which is right here, module, so that way it can be reached via URL. Okay. Any question? So as you can see, go ahead, buddy. We are able to enable the services and be able to terminal into that particular system at this point. Okay. So what that shows you is so he's logging in as a user here. He's a super user, right? It's loading his key. It copies that key, and then it allows him to connect to that system where he would be able to display the version and the build of that OS. And this one we're using PyEasy. Okay. So for the authentication piece of this, right, we see that how this is used with Juniper Junos. So we would do Juniper Junos import device, assuming that we already installed that, of course. And then we would have our device user password and then open. So it's going to connect to that device. And then we can tell it to display property and then end the session. So when you do a dev fax, that's just basically the property of that appliance, and then you close. So that method just end the session. Any question? So that this kind of give you some, introduction to different API for different type of appliances for networking, and then how you would be able to write that with Python. Okay. So this is the close-up of what we just looked at, but in this one, you do have the exception handling here. Okay. And then they're also getting parsing some information for the interface there. Okay, so I provided some output, right? So for the output, it shows interface information. If something was already set, it would be able to display. Now, I wanted to touch on Arista before we end, because we had to have like maybe one more question to answer. So Arista Networks is much larger in scale. So you would see Arista being used for data center, large data center. Okay. Juniper uses it for enterprise. Arista is much bigger than enterprise, multiple enterprises, cloud-based type of, organization. And then, you got some Cisco being used in some networks, like even small scale to large size. Now, Arista, it uses EAPI, and from what I've read, and I also checked, this only works with Python 2. Okay. So it also uses HTTP and HTTPS, and it's going to give you output in JSON. So now the direct command that it's using is get, post, put, and delete, where earlier you saw that the other two, it uses request and response, so they're kind of similar. This one you have additional commands that's used, so it's very close to what you see with HTTP verbs. Now the EAPI agent, that's what they call it. It's like the other two, it's off by default, so you have to enable it, and you would do it like this. Okay, so the interface would look slightly different, but you would go into configuration mode. All appliances, you have to get into configuration mode to issue the commands, and then you would do API HTTP commands, and you would tell it. So there's some stuff that's similar to Cisco and some stuff that's slightly, it's different, of course. Like no shut is similar, so you can have it list the commands. So first enable, access its commands after it's enabled, right? So it would show here that yes, it's enabled, and then it would have the HTTP commands, and it tells you that it's running its state, and then you can set port, and by default 443 is HTTPS, but you can also use 8080. Some administrator, they would use 8080 for the local HTTP server. Okay. And then for the Arista API, it looks like this, or EAPI. Just similar to the Juniper and the Cisco, you also have options in how you can issue the command. So you can type in the command like this. Okay. And then submit the post request like this, show version, and then it's going to give you the OS version. So here it's going to be the response, which is what we asked it to show version, right? So it shows you the bill, and then what that would be in JSON for the request. So again, you can check periodically. I think that there's a thread that talks about, when are they going to be able to support 3.8. There's some challenges in how it's gonna, they're still trying to work with the library, but if you look at this link, it is supporting 2.7. So Arista, if you're working with Arista appliance, you have to write in Python 2, where Juniper and Cisco, for the ones that we talked about earlier, that has Python 3 support. Okay, and down the line, you might see that they are phasing out, right? So you can check out the GitHub information. some additional discussions regarding how they're going to move forward. But to install the eAPI, the library, in order to work with eAPI for Arista, you would do a pip install JSON RPC lib like this. Okay. And then the example for to view the response, like what we see in the window from the interface that we saw earlier. This is how it's written in Python. So after you install the module, the library, then you would import it in and you would use the server, so that way you can access the system information and show its version. Okay.
There's a double underscore in front of future. Is that because?
Yeah, it's a namespace.
Oh, that's a namespace.
Mhm. It's a namespace from that library. Okay. And lastly, so I want to address the question before we jump off, right? So for Arista eAPI, the command that you can use, there are HTTP commands: get, post, put, and delete. How do you install Arista? You would, online script library, you would install JSON RPC lib. And then after that, you need to install Pi eAPI. Okay, so you need to install this, which is the online script library first. And then you need to install Pi eAPI module. And again, 2.7 only right now. Okay, so after you have the installation, then you can start writing your script for Arista appliances. So you have any questions for me? Did your lab go okay from last week? Were you able to get on your Raspberry Pi and virtual machines? I assume that you didn't send me any email or ask question right off, so that's
Oh.
good to know. Yeah.
I didn't know if on the Paramiko script that we were actually supposed to see a command line from the remote host. I mean, I did get some.
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you're gonna get that. You're gonna get that across. Sometime you're not gonna get the command line unless you ask for specific things. It's gonna directly access it and it's gonna give it to you. A lot of them are like that, right? These type of script and library is not designed for us to really truly interface it in a way a human would, right? It's machine to machine. So you know, if you ask it for something, it would be able to give it to you. But yeah, you're not going to be able to see, like, you know, other components that will be graphical based. Okay. So
Then-
yeah. Go ahead, Michelle.
I don't know. I have a question, but somebody else should ask before me.
Okay.
No, go for it, Michelle. Just
No, mine is indirectly related, so that's why I wanted to wait. If yours is directly related.
No, it's not. It's not.
Oh, I was happy to be able to convert this HP Stream 11 from Windows 10 to Linux
Okay.
laptop, and for some reason the day after I lost my IP address. What should I be researching to regain my IP address on my Ethernet interface?
Check your Wi-Fi router at home. Possibly that it's because if you whitelist it, it's seeing it as a foreign system, so it's kicking it off.
No, I'm using an Ethernet cable.
Okay, yeah, but it's still going through the wireless router.
No. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you MAC filter the on wireless router, like you add the system that you allow, maybe it's kicking it off because it's checking the rule. I would check that, but also check the driver for the network interface card to make sure that it's a stable driver version that will be, you want to troubleshoot from the system and then the network. So check the driver for the system first. If everything works, you might be able to find, like, because it's using the driver from the OS, and that might be unstable. So you might have to push updates on the actual OS or the driver itself, and then work your way toward the network. Check your router settings to make sure that it's not blocking it. Things like that.
For the assignment, we don't have a submit.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me enable that real quick. Thank you for telling me. Yeah, I saw also the chat. Chris, did you have a question for me too?
No, that was it.
Yeah, sometime I forget to check the box.
Oh,
One
actually,
sec.
is there a way you can open up the lab so we can get a head start?
Maybe tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to test my my script before I enable it, because I want to make sure it works. Otherwise, it's gonna go crazy. Like, we're gonna go crazy not getting it to work. I don't want to waste time, you know. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'll try to get something open tomorrow for you. Okay, so I enable it already. It should allow file uploads, I'm pretty sure. And then if you finish, you can turn that in. I'll try to get to the grading this week for week 3. We will have a homework assignment next week for our first 3 chapter quiz review, and then we'll have a quiz after that. Okay. Oh, and I didn't include some of the other libraries at the end of chapter 3. So if you have the text, you can check that out, but we will come back to the other libraries in a later chapter. Okay. All right. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining me. Type in your name in the chat. I will see you on Wednesday for the lab. Take care, everyone. You're welcome. Bye.
I got a question before I go.
Yes.
For that extra credit, what exactly? I didn't watch the videos, but what exactly does it encompass?
Oh, it's the 50 points extra credit is just to attend the session and learn something. But you
Okay.
have to register, because we partner up with IREX, who does the sponsor for global solutions with the UN. They require that everybody agrees to their term, because we're gonna record the video and then share it with them. And then they wanted to make sure that you are who you say you are, so they require like an ID picture that's uploading in the registration process. But yeah, you can just attend and then show your proof of attendance. We're going to do 3D printing, design, and also a little bit of programming at the end for Arduino.
Okay. The only problem is I'm at work during those times.
That I know. But we work with the school in Iraq, so it's like they're 11 hours ahead of us. But I'll try to stream it to YouTube, and then you can watch it later, because we're gonna try to do stream live through YouTube.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. All right.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.